You're listening to Operant Innovations, a podcast brought to you by ABA Technologies. This month on the Thought Leaders series, we are speaking with Dr. Denise Ross about where she came from and how she got to where she is today. Today we're here with Dr. Denise Ross, so thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I'm very excited because I've had the opportunity to somewhat work with Dr. Ross when we were both at Western, but not for too long. And she's held some stuff back today, even to be like, no, I'll talk to you about that later. So I'm very excited to hear your story and see what your thoughts are. And the first question is, who are you? And how did you get to where you are today?
Well, so I grew up in a small town in Ohio where I was one of just a handful of African-American children and really students of color within my community, within my school. My parents were really well, my mom's a nurse and my dad was a businessman. And so we grew up in like this middle-class household in a middle-class community, but I was one of a few Black children in that class, in that school. And I think that now looking back, some of the things I think now were shaped by those early experiences. So I remember that my first encounter so when my mom fought for me to not go to kindergarten. She had worked with me and she was just like, you can read and you don't need to go to kindergarten. So she kind of went to the school. She told the school that I didn't need to go to kindergarten, and they pushed back and they told her I did. And she made them test me, and they told her that, she's no genius, but she can skip kindergarten. I went into first grade, and my first experience with racism actually occurred in that first grade classroom. I had a teacher who openly accused me of cheating. I was 5 years old, and I had no clue what she was talking about. And I can look back now and see what that was, but at the time I didn't understand it. And I now feel like I've come full circle in terms of being able to help other children who may be having those experiences. Despite that, the school system was a really good school system, and my parents were really attentive, so I had an excellent education. But I had several family members, particularly first cousins, who did not have access to good schooling because of economic disadvantage. And they ended up not being able to even finish high school, never mind going to college. And so one of my cousins, for example, who I was very close to, when I was 19, I was a senior in college. And when she was 19, I was a junior in college. She was a senior in high school when she was 19. So it was just like I saw these disparities. And so those disparities really made me realize, I remember finishing high school and going, the differences between my cousins and me and my brother were that we had opportunities. We all came from the same family. But what was the difference? It was the opportunities we had. So I was very intentional at that point about that being my why. I wanted to go to college and somehow help change the systems that produced inequities in education, that consequently produced inequities in outcomes. My parents got divorced when I was in high school. And I had also been, like, as I said, one of a handful of Black students in this all completely white community. And so when I left college, I was very I just didn't have the best view of myself. I was insecure. My parents got divorced. I just remember feeling very insecure. And for me, I'd grown up kind of going to church, but church was not important to me. And I went to college, and I remember going into I went to Spelman College, which is an all Black women's college. And there I was able to be free of any type of real discrimination. There was no racism, there was no gender bias, because it was all women, mostly Black women. And I was surrounded by Black women who were PhDs. So at that point, I got to see, like, they kind of imprint on you. They're kind of like, okay, this is who you can be. And they tell you you're the top 10%, you're the top of the top, you're the cream of the crop. They tell you all of these things. And so Spelman produces these women who are just kind of go-getters because they do that. But I remember going into the room of a woman in my dorm, and she had a scripture on her wall. And I was like, why does she have a Bible verse on her wall? And I was like, she was our class president. And I remember thinking, she's successful despite having gone through racism, despite having gone through those things, because at the time for me, I was like, she's empowered by God. She's got this relationship with him, and this relationship with Christ is what's making her who she is. And at that point, I made a decision that that's what I was going to do. So I went home to my church in Columbus, and I got down on my knees, and I was like, God, take my life. And I needed that. It was like, for me, I needed to circle back to where my roots were and what was important to me. But it also empowered me to believe then that I could do anything, that I could accomplish the things I wanted to accomplish, even when they were hard. And it gave me a sense of purpose, right? And so I knew then that my purpose was to impact these kids. This is what I want to do with my life. And my why has followed me through all the other pieces of my story. So and having that feeling like, despite what had happened in my childhood, despite the things I'd gone through racially, that I had God's love to help me. And that was really helpful for me. Like I said, it was my why. And so I really knew then that I wanted to impact children who were economically disadvantaged and racially marginalized. So that intersection of race and poverty. And, it disproportionately affects kids who are children of color. And so I wanted to be a part of that. So I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. That's how I was going to do it. But while I was in college, I realized that being a lawyer, they weren't getting jobs. People weren't getting jobs. So I decided that I was going to get a backup. I was like, you still be a lawyer, but you need a backup. So I decided to minor in education. During my minor in education, we took an intro to special education class, and I did a field experience where I went to a high school, and worked with kids who had behavioral challenges. And it was at that point that I was like, I want to work in this field for behavior disorders. That's what it was at the time, emotional behavior disorders. So I went I wanted to go to teachers college, and I'd met a friend in college who was going to go there for graduate school. And I was like, this is what I'm going to do. So I went thinking I would focus on special education behavior disorders. I had no background in psychology. I went, and it was all behavior. It was behavior analysis. And Doug Greer was the head of the program. And I went my first semester, and I literally failed every single exam the whole first semester, because we had to take Heron and Heward and do verbatim written definitions of all those terms. And I was just like, I had no background. I had a friend who'd come from UCLA, and she'd worked with Ibar Lovas. So she knew it all, and I knew none of it. And so, but Doug had a recycle policy. So you could recycle, and they still have that, where you could recycle your quizzes. So every time I failed a quiz, I get to do it again. Well, in practicing it so many times, I learned it. By the end of the semester, Doug looked at me and he just goes, I see how hard you've worked. I see that this is how hard this has been for you. But there were lots of things he did, like he made us do lots of studies. So I think you had to do 5 studies your first semester or something like that. We had to do like research papers. And so I learned a lot. And he actually the next semester gave me funding, because I just had I was just poor. And he gave me funding to go to graduate school and finish out my semester. That semester, I decided to get my doctorate. I was 22 years old, and I went to him and I just said, I want to get my doctorate. And he lectured me on how it was a way of life. Are you sure you're going to do this? And I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do. And thankfully, like within that week, he wrote a grant and he got me money to go to graduate school. And so I did not have to pay for it, because I didn't have like stipends. I had to work. I worked like 80 jobs outside of graduate school. I tutored kids. I played the piano for churches. I just was like, but Doug made sure I had tuition money. And that was really helpful. I did that for those 5 years. I got to be mentored by him. And in that time period, the focus of that program was really verbal behavior. So I learned a lot about verbal behavior and ended up doing my dissertation in that area. I helped to start an autism program, the first ABA autism program in New York City public schools. It was a CABAS program, and I got to lead that. And now it's considered one of the best ABA programs in the state. I mean, in the city, in the school system, New York City school system, because they've continued. I mean, it was 20 some years ago when I did it, but they continued that, and it continued to be a placement for behavior analysis. Well, he mentored me, and he just really became a huge part of my life during that time period. I finished graduate school and went on to went to my first faculty position at Florida Atlantic University. I was 26. I went to teach there, and my department chair was a Black woman named Cynthia Wilson. Cynthia Wilson is not a behavior analyst, she's in special ed, but she made academia transparent for me. She was intentional about it. So she would tell me things like, you know, don't do a lot of service. Women do service all the time. It'll impact your ability to get tenure. And she was very intentional about protecting me and making sure that I was able to be successful. And so she taught me the ropes about, like, how do you survive here? What do you do? And then Jack Scott was there. And he's also an autism, and he was a behavior analyst there. The department chair was another behavior analyst named Michael Brady. And so I felt like I had some support then at the time. About the time, though, that I went there, I realized that I did not want to be at a teaching institution only. I wanted to be at a research institution. And Teachers College, they had an opportunity and they let me come back. And I came back and I got to focus mostly on research. When I was there, a couple of things. When I was in Florida, a significant thing that happened to me was that I would do field experiences and supervise student teachers in field schools. And I went into a school and there was this classroom full of kids who had emotional behavioral disorders. That was their label. And there were like first graders through third graders. And on the side was a little boy who was like 5 years old, 6 years old. And while everybody else was learning to read, he wasn't learning to read. And I asked the teacher, why is this student not reading? I had just come from kids with autism who couldn't speak, right? And so I'm in this room and I'm like, he doesn't have a developmental disability. Why is he not, not that people with developmental disabilities can't learn to read, but there was no real obvious reason to me. He didn't have any, why was he not doing it? And the teacher said to me, he has an intellectual disability. And it was a label in Florida. Florida used to have labels. They'd label people like educably mentally handicapped, trainably mentally handicapped. And he's like, he's educably mentally handicapped and he cannot learn to read. And I was livid. I left there. I got in my car and I was like, why can't he learn to read? And I remember, as I'm telling you the story, that before that, when I was teaching kids with autism, we taught them to read. And I remember the principal at one of the schools I was at saying, why do they need to learn to read? They'll never use it. And being very livid about, like, if they can learn, they need all the help that they can get. So you have like this experience where the principal's telling me you shouldn't teach kids to read. You have this experience where I go into the school and they tell me this little boy cannot learn to read. I took him. First I was mad. And on the way home, I made some phone calls. A colleague and I got together. We wrote a grant. We got money to come back in and teach those kids to read. But I took him one day and I sat down with him and I said, you're going to read. And he looked at me and he goes, I can't read. And I go, you're going to read today. And I took Edmark reading and he read. And because Edmark, the way it's designed, you read very quickly. And he stopped and he was just shocked. And so then we took a model, took what behavioral reading curricula, developed this model where you do, use fluency, direct instruction, and then let the teachers choose their own kind of portion of that curriculum, choose their own curriculum that they want to use, some activity they want to do, and then also do standardized testing with the kids and do regular meetings with the teachers. A graduate student and I did that. We did it at that elementary school and at a middle school. The first year we did it, everybody was skeptical. The kids made so much progress that the next year the principal said at the middle school, do it with all the kids who can't read. So we took all these kids. And so I looked at that and I was like, hey, this is working. I then went on to Teachers College, and at Teachers College, I worked and did something similar with 8 community schools and with programs in the community. So within churches, within local schools on the weekends, my students and I would go out and we would do this. And I teach the students how to teach kids to read. And so this passion for like kids learning to read was really coming back to me in terms of like the importance of this. I also, though, at that time was learning how to build relationships with communities. So going out into Harlem, like, how do we do it? And I got to see how they saw us. So they looked at Columbia like the ivory tower. You're coming in, you have no idea what we want. So I lived in Harlem, but worked at Columbia and got to see how it looked, how Columbia thought they were doing the community a favor and the community did not see it that way. And so while I was at Columbia, I think I was on like 43 dissertation committees, and all of them were mostly around relational frame. And so it was about the time that like Dermot Burns Holmes wrote relational frame theory, and I we were all doing work in that. And so this whole idea of like generative responding at that point became, because of all the practice with the students there, I became very familiar with it. So I took away from Teachers College this idea of like, what does it look like for the community to see you come into it? And then also, how can you embed relational frame theory, relational, the whole concept of a frame into reading, right? And what does that look like? So it added to what I knew. My father had an accident and I decided to move to Chicago to be closer to him. And I went to work at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, which is where Chuck Merbitz, who was passed away a couple of years ago, and he hired me to work on program building. So there I got to help develop a doctoral program and help develop a school. And when an elementary school that was focused on behavior analysis. In that time period, Joe Lang and his wife helped with some of the initial starting of that along with Doug. And Joe allowed me to come to Seattle, and Joanne and Joe let me stay in their house, and they taught me so much about what they were doing there. And I got to go to Head Sprout and see up close what they were doing. But the one thing I learned from watching that, in addition to the amazing work they were doing, was they explained to me that at Head Sprout, they didn't replicate and give anyone, they didn't take an idea and replicate it across hundreds of children until they watched it with just one child. And they got the kinks out with one child before they replicated it with lots of kids. And what I took away from that was, this, if you take these, if you have an idea or you have a plan or you have a research idea that's new, test it with just a very small group first, because if you don't, you replicate mistakes, right? So get the kinks out in a very small. So these are all like the significant stepping stones that led me to this place. And so we started the school. The kids, we had some successes. The kids read really well. We did the same thing I'd done at the elementary school in Florida and the middle school in Florida, only we used 100 lessons to teach your child to read. We used like age appropriate things, and the kids came out reading really well. But there were also lots of systems, things I didn't understand. Like I didn't understand, and I learned in this situation how school funding is so important in terms of what happens, and how Chicago has one of the lowest per pupil funding rates, or it used to at that time. And so when you're just talking about starting a school, that funding has to fund both operations and education, where a school district has like centralized operations. So I learned in that situation, just like to kind of focus and narrow myself on reading only, as opposed to like, oh, I'm going to go out and just build a school that's going to help all these kids. That's not something I could do, but I could do reading. And I saw how our kids learned to read. And even though there were lots of things, I think I learned, like after that, I took a business class because I was like, I don't know, this was like starting a business. So I went and took a 9-month certificate class, and I was like, I'm going to learn how to do this better. I, after that, went to DePaul University for 2 years, where they taught me how to teach online. And about that time, Dick Malott asked me to come and speak at Western Michigan asked me to come speak. I did, and then there was a position there later, and I went and applied for the position, and it was to help start their online program. So that was what I did. So all those previous experiences like DePaul helped prepare me for that. At Western Michigan, I think I learned 3 major things. One was systems. I mean, I remember telling Doug, I'm like, man, I'm learning so much about systems. He's like, CABAS is a system. Why didn't you learn that? But I learned so much from watching how BATS operated, how, and the emphasis in that department from the OBM program and everything that was there about systems. And my students who come through BATS or who had come through the OBM program actually began to teach me about systems. And they would come into the lab and say, we've got to break this up into smaller pieces. We've got, so I learned so much from them. I also learned the importance of what it meant to mentor and advocate for Black students. I had a lab that had a lot of students in it that were students of color. I had Hispanic students, I had Black students, and what it meant to mentor, what it meant to be somebody who had to kind of talk them down from quitting at times because of the experiences they were having. And so I learned that, and then I learned a lot about reading. We did a lot of reading work, and I learned a lot about building relationships with the community, rural communities. I hadn't worked in rural communities, so that taught me about that. But mostly, I think there I had a chance to begin to really process my own views on kind of the role that racial bias plays in what happens in our field and in the world. And I'm grateful for that, because when I went to my next position, which is now at the University of Wisconsin, which is where I currently am chair of the Institute for Urban Education, which is an institute that helps address critical teacher shortages in urban communities. And so we work with several school districts around Wisconsin. But one of the things that's an emphasis in Wisconsin is this idea that the university has a role in helping to balance inequitable systems that are imbalanced because of race. Wisconsin has an interesting history in terms of racial discrimination. And so the state has an emphasis on doing work that helps to address racial inequities. And I get to apply behavior analysis to that. So now I realize it's not just reading. I need to now do reading in addition to helping people understand, helping to build innovations or build interventions that will help address systemic issues. And so for me, what's helped with that is being able to operationalize behaviors, being able to ask really significant questions. What's the most, really significant questions about why things are happening and how they're happening. And so I'm finding out that there's this intersection between kind of that focus on academics that I've had, which is an issue in Wisconsin. 10% of the Black children there read proficiently. And that's in the country, there's an issue with reading across all groups. And so it's that, but then also this intersection of race and how if you can see literacy as a form of social justice. So if you can teach a child to read, then you will increase their outcomes. If I myself become what people are now defining as anti-racist, but I don't empower a child to do better, I have done nothing, right? And so that's one of the things that we really emphasize. And I'll take us back to the beginning of this. And what I said is that I then get to circle back to who I was as a kid when I was 5 years old in a community where there weren't a lot of Black children, and someone accused me of cheating, and the feeling I had and how that impacted my life. And now I can come in on the flip side of that, use systems to empower other children to not experience that. And then I can still follow the trajectory of my why, which is to help address systemic inequities based on that intersection between economic disadvantage and race. So it's kind of been full circle for me at this point to take all these experiences and go, okay, but how does this relate back to this problem I've been seeing since I was a kid?
Well, and it's so neat to hear too, because this is a question I'm constantly scouring social media just for work related purposes to see what people are talking about right now, especially in the field, because not being in the clinical realm anymore, I'm a little bit more removed from what's going on. Right. And one thing I always see is what else can we do with behavior analysis? Right. And it's really hard for me not just to do anything because you can, but what you're doing now and just, how it's really cool to see how almost everything that you've done has kind of built on top of each other. Yeah. It's really built, each little step has really built onto this other to make it into something even bigger.
Even the things I thought were bad, even the things that I was like, why am I in this? Like, why am I? Because I've been my whole career often the only African-American in most of my settings as a faculty member, except for like my very first one. And then at Teachers College, there were a couple. But even when in those settings, I can still say that all the experiences forced me to process my own perspectives. So even the things that seemed bad, seemed to me not to be very healthy or good at the time, I feel like still I'm grateful for those things. So.
And it gives me hope too, because I know you kind of started in that more of an education background. And when I talk to people, I was at Western, I didn't mean to go for behavior analysis, but that's what I found, and I'm very happy I did. But now I'm trying to do something different too. And so just seeing your progression as well through all of these different things into like it gives me hope too, on a personal level. And I can see how that can also, that, I'm talking for other people now, but that can also do it the same thing for others.
You know your why. You know your why. If you know your why, no matter where you are, you can always do that same thing, right? So if you're that trajectory, that thread of like, what are you supposed to do and what are you good at, and how can your life be a blessing to other people? But I think we think of that often as like this kind of touchy-feely thing, but I think science helps. I think that your ability to gain skills helps other people, your development helps other people. And so all your skill sets can benefit somebody else. So, my students who graduated with me, graduated with their doctorates with me, I wanted to advise them to go in. A lot of them I thought were really good researchers. I want to see more. I think we need more Black researchers in behavior analysis. I don't see enough. I'm trying to work right now with like different programs that are trying to do that. But I do think that I really was like, can you, and it was really Dick Malad who was like, we need to make sure we have more, Black researchers. And he's the one who started me on that. And until that time, I actually hadn't thought about it. I hadn't thought about across the whole field who's out there, because when I came into the field, there were, but then they've retired. And so I see this, and so I wanted them to go to academia. I watched them kind of choose like clinical jobs. And at first I just thought, why are you doing that? But I do think that when you're younger, so I started my academic career teaching college when I was 26. You don't always know what you want to do at 26. And so some of my development has been me developing and making shifts. So yes, I've moved some, I've tried to follow my why. I've moved to a few, to me, what seems like a number of institutions, it feels like. But the thing is, I was young. So you don't know all the time where, and so that those people who stay in one place forever, it just isn't there anymore. So I actually admire my students' ability to say, this is not what I want to commit to right now. I'm going to try these different things and decide which ones I want to do. Everybody doesn't come out just kind of knowing. And so while I've stayed in academia, I have moved as I've developed as a person into what I want more and more. And that has shifted over time. So.
Well, and I think that you show too that just because you're in academia, from what I've seen since, I met you and I've known you, is that you still, it's not just strictly in this ivory tower in academia. You don't close yourself off in that bubble.
Right.
You purposely go out into the communities that you are in and try to see, okay, what can we do in these communities?
Yeah. And you're always learning. Like, you do it so you can learn, and you learn from everything. I remember I didn't tell this significant part of the story, but when we started that elementary school, the university, well, not but university faculty we were partnered with, because we were partnered with a couple of universities, would come in and would offer to help us. And it was the first time I'd been on the flip side of, I was now looking at the ivory tower going, while I'm a faculty member there and I'm doing this, I really need you to come in and be more supportive. And so I got to see what it felt like to be in the role of a principal, the role of a teacher, and have have someone come and tell you, my research can help you. And you're just like, no, if it can, I can't even hear you right now. It's like, I got to you got to feed people first before you can actually, give them any information or anything like that. And so, all of those things, it's like what you're saying, as you go out into these communities and you do things, you learn yourself. And it helps, I think, with intervention research, because you can put yourself in the place of the people who will ultimately consume your research. And I think one of the issues our field gets into is that we don't always think about how your intervention has to shift for the culture or group that will be impacted by it. And so we have data, it works, it may not be right for this group. And why? What are the barriers? What would stop them from implementing it with fidelity? What would stop it from being used? And a lot of times people go, well, we give them this information. Why don't schools use these effective things that we do? Because there's some reason, and we need to spend time in that school, time in that organization, just watching, which when you get to the question about like, where should the field go, I'll talk about that more, because I do think one of the mistakes we make is assuming that the experience we had with it in a couple settings is going to transfer to a different one. But you will not know how to design an intervention well unless you've sat in an environment, seen what they do, seen what their issues are, and then you can design it. Not come in and say, here's what you should use. I don't know, right? And so if you really want to think about the people we're going to impact, we have to think about, put ourselves in their shoes. The only way to do that is to spend time there, right?
Well, that's really neat too, because I worked in some schools throughout Metro Detroit, and that always brings me back to the one example that I had. I was working in this, it was a classroom for students who had Down syndrome, and it was specific to students who had Down syndrome. And there was one student that they were having some behavioral issues with. He wasn't at the same functioning level as some of the other middle schoolers that were there. And the teacher and paraprofessional were just kind of lost. They're like, we don't know. We don't know what to do right now. And the whole classroom environment is becoming this mess because of it. And I ended up, I'd go in almost an hour every single day, just 1 hour every single day, where I would take over for the paraprofessionals the entire time. They're like, wait, I don't have to do anything? Like, no. They're like, why not? I was like, I don't know. I don't know what we're doing yet. Why would I have you do this?
Good for you.
And yeah, so like I literally was like, well, let me figure out, because when I sat in on the IEP meeting, they're like, oh, behavior analyst is here. Okay, what's wrong? I was like, honestly, on paper, this looks really good. He's like, I'm not sure, I want to see what's going on with it, because I don't think anything needs to change on your plan. They're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
And so I sat in and I took over for one of the entire hours.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I got into, their the stuff that they put in place, it was just little tweaks. It was really just little tweaks, but I got to sit there for the entire class period, for that one class period. And sometimes it'd be more, sometimes I would just be a check-in, but in the beginning, it was, I took over for that entire class period, and they were like, wait, how did you do that? And you could see, even though the paraprofessionals were very happy to have a break,
right,
they were still sitting there observing me.
Right.
And then they would be like, wait, how did you just do that?
Yeah.
How did you just get the student to do that?
You can do it, they can do it. It makes a whole difference. To sit and walk in someone else's shoes helps you know how to design an intervention better. It's like you said, you said it perfectly. It's little tweaks, it's the little things that we don't see. I remember when did I realize this? I was asked to come in and help with the reading program in Chicago, and it was for kids who were in an alternative school setting. So they were high schoolers from 9th grade to 12th grade, but they were high schoolers who had trouble graduating. There was a mini school system in Chicago, it was a charter school system that had, I think it was 4,000 students in 20 some schools. And they said, a good percentage of our kids can't read. Can you come in? I was like, cool, we'll come in, we'll do, same thing I've done everywhere else, direct instruction, fluency. And they said to me, our students won't do direct instruction because they think it's babyish. They won't do it. That's interesting. And then they began to explain to me all the barriers to why their students couldn't learn to read, why you couldn't come in and just implement something. And I never thought about it. I never thought about the fact that secondary schools aren't built to teach kids to read. So if they come there reading, there's no place for them not reading. There's no place for them to do it. There were so many things they said. So when I came to Western, I was like, I want to design a curriculum that's built with this in mind, so that you could implement it and not have to go do a whole curriculum, but you just target where the students are missing something. And that's what my students and I worked on. But it came from spending a semester. I would take students from Western back to Chicago, and we would go spend time in those settings. You learn because you spend time there. And I think that that's a direction that we need to go in. So
thank you for listening to this episode of Thought Leaders. Come back next month as Dr. Ross tells us where she thinks the field is going or where she would like to see it go. And as always, if you have questions, comments, feedback, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to us at Operant Innovations at abatechnologies.com.